I first met Emmett there at VCU. We've worked together on a couple of different projects, ranging from filmmaking to sound making. And Emmett actually was sort of tracking the initial release of DALL-E 2 right along with me. We were sending excited notes back and forth. And then Emmett actually signed up to get access and got access before me. So I was very much like, oh my gosh, what are you doing with it? What are you doing with it? Um, Anyways, and I think that's as far as I'll go with the intro. And I'll just turn it right over to you, Emmett.
I'm gonna get started just by ways of an intro. I went to VCU, which is how I know Dana. I graduated in 2014. I studied photography in the photo film program there. And I met Dana, who at the time I think was just completing his grad program there. And then we ended up teaching together, first with me as like a TA, and then we ended up co-teaching some of the VCU summer courses, which were super fun. So I've known Dana for quite a while, and since, all the way back then, we've chatted about ideas and dream projects and all that stuff. So it's fun to come back and do these talks. I'm not in LA right now, but I've been based in Los Angeles since 2015. So I've been out there for about 8 years. I'm going to talk a lot about like just my general approach to photography and art making, image making. A lot of the beginning stuff is not involving AI, and then I will get to the AI. And the reason I'm going to do it that way is because I think the way that AI works for me is greatly informed by a lot of the ideas and approaches that I'm going to talk about that just interest me in general. So without further ado, creatively, like I work in photography mainly, both shooting images, but also working with pre-existing imagery. And that is to say, I'm not always shooting myself. I'm many times also pulling images from that already exist and kind of building upon them, references to like the image culture that's all around us, and then finding ways to like sample those images and then put my own hand back into it, like build upon it, remix it, sometimes through the camera itself, like an intervention of like a flash, in this case, or in the sort of post-production stage, manipulating it in Photoshop, etc. And creating like the image culture itself, and then creating images of my own that sort of bridge all those disparate references that I'm pulling. When I was first getting into art in high school and photography specifically, I was really interested, as I think many young artists are, in like the pop art movement and Warhol. And so I think that approach, like the way that he would pull, in this case, this is like a fashion image, but pulling those examples of like kind of glamorous photography or newspaper photography of the time, imagery that was like in the zeitgeist. That definitely was something that I think has stuck with me to this day. And so there's a lot of ways, there's a Warhol reference there as well, pretty directly. But so this pre-existing media is always kind of showing up in my work in one way or another, whether through an integration as direct as ripping a page out of a magazine and putting it in a scene and photographing it. Other times it's incorporating a piece of stock imagery and sneaking that in with an image that I took myself. Other times it's cropping it or manipulating it in a way that it makes it totally unclear that it's actually a pre-existing image, or an image at all. For example, that image at the very front, the pink kind of orange gradient, that's like a really tiny detail of like a billboard or something that I then just like blew up and turned it more into like a gradient. So it's like finding these like elements out in the world, and pulling them in through the lens of the camera that I'm using to resample it. Tangentially, like I have a pretty big interest in music and more specifically like DJing. And I way when I was in college, I would mix music and play some shows, and it's still something that I dabble in every now and then. But I think that idea of DJing and building soundscapes and sampling sounds in the world, there's a similar approach there that I use with photography as well. So over time, like that approach of like using pre-existing imagery or found imagery, and making that a part of my practice, over time that really focused in to where, in the example of an image like this, the object itself is the photograph. It's not just like a thing. This is not a CD that's in like a larger tableau image or a larger composition. It's like the objects themselves become the focus, and that kind of happened by accident. And for a while, I was just kind of collecting these things that I would find out in the world. If you live in a big city, you find a lot of interesting like trash on the ground, quite literally. And like I was finding when I moved to Los Angeles and just exploring, like you would find these really interesting juxtapositions of like man-made objects, organic objects, kind of mixing together. And in this case, this isn't really about the movie Avatar. It's more about, this is like a fantasy object. It's an object that represents like an unreality or an escape, or like the dreamlike focus or dreamlike forces rather of movie making. And in this case, like a huge element of pop culture, but then it's mixed in with this like natural organic grass around it. And so there's always a bit of that kind of push-pull between these kind of synthetic fantasy, fake imagery, or that are images in a book reproduced, and then the quote unquote reality elements of plants and organic life that is in between. So that kind of contrasting forces is something that over time I learned was becoming more of a style that I was interested in, and achieving that balance. And I think especially in the age that we live in now, where there's so much focus on like AI and technology and these kind of futuristic ideals, but we're still having to contend with like the everyday base reality and like this, the world that we live in, which is not perfect. So I think it's like, there's an interest I have in how do you explore that? How do you make work that's about like living in that time, that's not literally showing those things? So a lot of this stuff, these objects that get pulled in or staged as almost ready-mades, they become like shorthand for not literally what they are, but what they represent, and things like that. So there's always these elements of real, staged, found, all mixed together. And these are all from different series, and a lot of the images these are 4 different zines that I've made in the last couple of years. The left being the oldest one, and the one on the right being the most recent that I made last year. The way that I work is essentially building up a large catalog of imagery, a library of images that I can then go back later and pull from. And it's not really until I get to a point of declaring a sequence that, like, for me, the magic starts to happen with photography. And Dana's heard me talk about this a lot, where images get created at different times with different motivations. Sometimes they're captured with little thought consciously, and it's more just an instinctual trust that I'm going to shoot this interesting object that I find out in the world, or I stage a photo shoot with somebody, and I'm not really sure how any of these things connect. And in some ways they don't connect until at a certain point I know I'm going to stop, and maybe I've got a title in my head, or I've got some themes in my head, And at that point, I basically create, an umbrella around all that work. And then I start going through everything from a year or 2 years of shooting, or more, and pulling images that I think have connections between them. And that's where like meaning is kind of born out of it, through the juxtaposition, through the contrast, through the similarities. And also just, I think it's important to work for me and stuff in projects like zines, because they're self-initiated, they're easy to make. I should say, like, my personal art practice is not how I make money. I have a creative job, which is very fortunate. And I've gotten to work with a lot of different artists and cool people in the creative sector. So that's been amazing. But I think what's important about maintaining a personal art practice, at least for me, is building up your own creative universe is, I think, super important, because what that does is it levels up your taste and your aesthetics, and you refine the way that you think about your work or talk about art. And even if you're not selling your work, I went to art school and I'm not selling my work, and in some ways that people would think that's like, the definition of what success looks like from an art school perspective. But I'm able to use all the knowledge I have from school, and also everything I've done since then, to bring that into the workspace, into creative, commercial projects that I'm involved in. And so art always opens up doors if maintaining that personal practice. So zines is one way that I'm able to take stock of what I've been doing, kind of make chapters in the larger series that is ongoing, my body of work. And also, like, I love a slide like this, because these images that I made to document the zines, like, creation begets further creation. And so you shoot the images, which is one awesome way to be creative. Then you put them together as a series, then you make a zine, then you photograph the zine. It's one thing is leading to another. And I love that kind of constant self-initiated world building. Even the settings like that I'm photographing these books in, to me, they're part of like building up these visual tropes that I'm utilizing in my work. And so that's a huge part of what I do and what I think about. A lot of what you're seeing here, some of them are older, from some of these zines. When I get to the AI stuff in a little bit, a lot of that is from a new zine that I'm working on, that I'm gonna probably in the next couple months get ready to start printing and add to the collection. So, and then this, in terms of, so that was just to summarize. This idea of building up a library is one part of my work that's super important. Pulling from pre-existing media and mixing that with my own hand and images that I shoot myself. That's the other ingredient in my work. In terms of thematics and what I think about and what is the narrative, such as it is, within my work. And this is more recent. I started to think about this. There's a concept known as hauntology. And so I've got the Wikipedia line there, this is a wider, it's not necessarily an art philosophy. It's a cultural philosophy. It's a political philosophy as well. But it's essentially a persistence of elements from the social or cultural past that are quote unquote haunting the present moment, such as in the manner of a ghost. And then I've got a great Mark Fisher quote that I love. This idea of being haunted by what once was, what could have been, and what could still happen. So what I've done here is I've basically adapted this into a way that makes sense for me to think about my work, which is I'm essentially shooting and creating my own literal like landscape that's haunted and haunted landscape. So I really think of it now as like these are windows into scenes of imagine going into a landscape, really more of like someone's headspace, where everything is in the way that our mind works. everything is kind of piled on top of each other and strewn about in kind of an unexpected order. And you've got this mysterious world where there are all these inhabitants, like people and bits of objects that maybe represent like memories or moments in time. Sometimes I think about it in ways that experiences that have happened to me. Other times it's just things around me, what's happening again in that zeitgeist. And then there's echoes of all these different things working together, but also, and I think this is where what's key also for me is it's not quite complete. Like there's an anonymity to it. If there's a person in these photographs, you don't know who it is. Maybe it's the back of them. Maybe it's an image that's been covered up, a message that's been covered up. There's a kind of a halfway quality to some of these, and you could say an unresolved quality. I like to think of it also as like there's a disappointing quality to it. And what I mean by that is, again, it's unresolved. And in the context of a bigger narrative I think of, traveling through this interior landscape, haunted landscape, and all these different bits and pieces and people, and seeking to like break through that and like this existential, I guess, sort of thing of wanting to break through that and like find something real, and which is what we're all kind of looking for. And I think it's pretty clear also, like the way that I photograph, similar to what I was saying about the avatar image, the way that I shoot is very, very singular. So I typically, I'm shooting vertically, so it's a tight frame. I tend to crop out a lot of like extraneous visual elements. Like I don't like really like seeing like words or anything in the back. Like it's about what the kind of main subject is. And it's typically photographing the person or the object in a way that, like I was saying before, it isn't about the visual literal subject. Sometimes it's like finding things or people that become vessels for like a fantasy or a desire or a bigger idea. They're a shorthand for something else in the culture or in the this interior headspace. And also what's cool is when you photograph in a very tight way like this, for me, going back to this idea of this bigger catalog that I then pull from to make, different sequences and different series, they all look cohesive and they could all be conceivably part of the same body of work, even if they've been shot at completely different times, years apart, because there's not really a ton of stuff pulling it to a specific time or place. So it really is, for me, more and more about removing all that stuff and then putting it back together in a way that it's like, this is a world that I'm building. And so that's like a really fun way to engage with the things that are around me. And so getting now into another part of my practice that over the last couple of years has become like pretty important to me. I did a screening in like a little video screening in LA in 2019 that was loosely based around this idea of hauntology and like quote unquote haunted media. So there was a lot of like lo-fi. I forgot to mention this before, but in visual art and music, the way that hauntology kind of shows up is an integration of like lo-fi aesthetics or out of date aesthetics. And this is like actually fairly popular now, where it'll be the use of something like a camcorder, or in music, like a great example is the artist Burial, who uses a lot of like old tape sounding things, and there's like a very analog feel to it. There's like a texture to the music itself, and so it's like a nostalgic element, but you're not, in some cases it's like nostalgia, but you're not really even sure like what you're nostalgic about. So camcorder is like a very heavy way to get into that for me. So I did a screening in 2019. Dana was actually in that and had a really cool camcorder video. And around that same time, like I bought a camcorder myself and started to experiment with it. I was using it mainly, and I still am, like more for like the still photography that I could get out of it. I'm definitely somebody that likes like the most like low intensity gear that I can carry around with me everywhere, the better. And so like this camcorder that I have is great because I can basically like fit it in my pocket almost and take it with me, everywhere I'm going. And because it's like a consumer grade camera, like it can kind of shoot in like any scenario and get like a somewhat usable image. And the ease of shooting in that way really like freed me up. And I started taking it everywhere. And I really started to get drawn into like the unique look of these images that I would shoot video and then pull the stills out afterwards. So obviously it's lo-fi, it's 480p. There's an element of compressing reality that's occurring, and abstraction. The textures get all muddied, and it gives its own kind of unique layer on top of like fuzziness. So it really unlocked a new curiosity for the world around me, and everything like looks more interesting to me through the camcorder. I think it helps open you back up, at least it did for me, to like virtually everything like around me, and taking it into settings where I might not think that there would be interesting things to photograph, but then using the tropes of the medium itself. There's a crazy zoom on it, for instance, so you can photograph things from very far away, kind of discreetly as well. And that's cropping in a very extreme way. In order to get the footage off of the camera, you have to essentially plug it into your computer and then screen record it in real time as it plays back the footage in QuickTime. So what's cool about that is when you rewind the tape or fast forward, you get this kind of glitchy, blocky effect that you can see here. And it also, when two clips meet, you start to get almost like a double exposure type thing where two pieces of two clips are appearing on top of one another. So using those tropes and even like the kind of kitschy, like built-in effects on the camcorder, in this case, like there's a thing where it makes a cube that spins, and like whatever you're pointing your camera at, it's like showing up in the quadrants of the cube. Like trying to use these things like and taking them seriously at face value, and trying to like create, like in this case, like it's like, how do you make like a weird, interesting looking piece of quote unquote art, using these kind of consumer grade kind of goofy effects, and then also just like continuing to build out the same way that I would with the quote unquote better camera, real camera, or whatever you want to call those earlier images, continuing to like build out the storyline and the characters in like this world that all my images inhabit, and embracing like the unexpected weird exposures and the ways that it separates the imagery and the double exposure effects, sort of getting what clip that I had recorded when I'm recording a new one, and then seeing what happens later on when I'm importing, things like that. And thematically, again, like especially with the camcorder, thinking about like this like liminality, this like fantasy space, where like the imaginary or the fantasy is right up against quote unquote reality, and with the visual effects like the glitching and the multiple imageries, like the literal distortions of the camera. It's almost like I think about like a simulation that's like collapsing on itself and like is not really, like I said before, it's disappointing. It's like not quite, a perfect place. And it's it's kind of not sustainable in that way. So that's all the camcorder stuff that I shoot, just ongoing. And that brings me to the AI element. The camcorder, like I said, in an aesthetic sense, it's really pointing towards the artistic definition of hauntology, in the sense of it's this lo-fi, it's this nostalgic visual approach, and then mixing that with the AI. So all the images now from this slide are made through AI, and more specifically, and I'll explain this, it's AI like mixed with the camcorder. Initially, like a year ago, I guess, when DALL-E, as Dana was saying earlier, I got into like the DALL-E beta or whatever it was, and I don't have any of them here, but initially, the approach that I was using was just like trying to make images that looked like real photographs. Again, real photographing quote. Images that looked like photographs I could take myself, or maybe that I did take myself. And especially a year ago, it's developed a lot now. It's still not perfect in this sense, but as you probably know, like the AI has quirks in how it renders things. And so especially back then, like I could get pretty close to an image that looked, like it wasn't necessarily made with AI, but there would always be elements, faces, hands, etc., where it would kind of give it away. It wasn't quite perfect. And even though there is something interesting about that, for me, I was a little frustrated. And then eventually I started to think about like one way that I could use that AI in a way that felt very authentic to what I was already doing, was bringing the camcorder into it and bringing that lo-fi aesthetic into it. So all of these images are made through generating an image in an AI software. A lot of these are early ones from DALL-E. I've also used Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, so kind of the whole gamut, playing around with each one as they progress. But I'm generating an image, and then I am using my camcorder to record my screen. So I'm pointing it at my computer screen, at the image that I've generated, and then I'm essentially resampling it through the camcorder. And then I am importing that to my computer and pulling out the stills, much as I would just shooting footage out in the world to begin with. So you get, when you're recapturing the generated image in that way, especially then when you integrate these techniques I was talking about, like the glitches, the rewind kind of effects, it further removes it from that, oh, it's an AI image, and it brings it more into the world that I'm already working in and the style that I'm working in. And there's all kinds of like visual tricks that I've tried to not obscure the AI element of it necessarily, but create things that just have like that dreamlike lo-fi quality to them, even sometimes before the camcorder gets involved. So for example, like they're shaking the camera when you're recording it, or it's telling the AI in the generation to make an image that's slightly out of focus. So that does help obscure some of like the anatomical weirdness, but it also further distorts it. It gives it that kind of odd quality. And yeah, apart from the camcorder re-recording and then importing, I do a bit of like color manipulation. And yeah, so some of these, there was definitely an approach at first to try to make images that could coexist alongside, let's say, camcorder images that weren't made with AI or didn't involve any AI. This idea of, could I have a series where there's a bunch of camcorder stuff, and I'm not telling you which ones are AI or would anyone notice which ones, how they were made, what was the origin point. More and more, though, I'm letting myself go a little bit and being more free in the experimentation and embracing like the more fantastical or surreal or just kind of odd qualities of, again, inherent to the medium that you're working in. So even though, there's the camcorder that has its own quirks, like the AI can also do its own unique things. So there's that element to it as well, where just trusting that there's interesting things happening. And even if I get a generated image that I'm not quite sure about, similar to the way that I work just in general with photography, it's trusting like your intuition, and that like I just generate a bunch of stuff and then I come back to it later and I see one and I'm like, oh, okay, that actually now is like striking me in a different way. Or when you bring a camcorder in to start rephotographing and resampling, it takes on a new life. Or maybe it's when you're rewinding and importing the footage, it takes on a new life. So there's a lot of like trust elements to it. It doesn't just stop with making an image in the AI for me. There's multiple layers of artistic intervention on my part, and thus chances for like happy accidents and transformations that I didn't expect. There's the initial generation itself, which sometimes there's multiple levels of that where I'm doing variations and tweaking the prompt. There's the rephotographing it with the camcorder, which gives it that wash of the AI, the 480p lo-fi quality. That also has a ton of variables associated with it. The lighting in the room that I'm in when I'm re-recording it, the focus, like I said, the zoom on the screen, can all affect how that re-photographed image looks. And then also then the rewinding, which creates unexpected juxtapositions, and gives it like, I love the like painterly quality of these where they get kind of smudgy. And something else that I love that this image is a good example of is when even though you're leaning into like some more kind of weird, surreal, fantastical elements, maybe, how do you still like incorporate elements, whether it's the composition or the color, that still make it look like it's coming from my mind or my eye. So even though I'm not necessarily trying to trick you and make it look like it's an image that I really shot, I still think it's important to just to be authentic to like what I am into and the aesthetics that I've already established, and trying to sneak in your own tropes with the AI. So in this example, it's like having it look like it's being shot like through a window, or there's like this kind of graded element in between the subject matter and the viewer. That's something that I incorporate a lot, like shooting through different things or having elements like protruding into the frame in between the camera and the subject. So things like that, it's kind of fun to try to get the AI to follow through with that and understand it. And even when it gets it wrong, I've got a quote at the end that touches on this. Even when it doesn't quite understand what you're telling it, there's still kind of a magic in just like feeding it that information. And that to me is almost like you set that in motion, and then what you get is what you get, and there's working with that. So over time, there's definitely been more of a lean into this kind of, I don't know, like cinematic. The other thing that's kind of cool about the AI is, as an artist, I think it's really important. Like, it's not just about the work you're making. It's like, what are you watching? What are you listening to? those things feed into your art, but you also feed that back out into the world. So, when I talk about world building as an artist, it's not just limited to what may or may not be in the images that I'm shooting or creating. The music that I listen to, or the music that I might play at an exhibition of my work, or the clothes that I'm wearing, or the clothes that people in my foot, like all these things are part of the world building. And so what's kind of been interesting about the AI more recently for me is plugging in references to, or trying to get it to make images that are inspired by movie references that I'm giving it, or references to directors that I like, film ideas that I have, and then seeing so some of these get a bit more these are pretty recent. So, there's always kind of constant tweaking and figuring out what's working and more interventions, et cetera. But plugging in references to that pop culture that in some cases I'm literally pointing towards in my work, and then seeing how the AI is interpreting that and remixing that. So that idea of feeding in your influences, some of these get a bit more cinematic and kind of, I don't know, high production value, I guess you could say, in terms of I was getting all these weird, almost 80s looking hairstyles the other day. And there's something kind of cool about that where I couldn't necessarily shoot these easily. But it's quite literally engaging with the fantasy creator and the simulation itself. So from a thematic point of view, I also find that very interesting. Giving it fantasy films and pieces of pop culture that are essentially stories and dreams, and then having it remix those. So yeah, I'm reaching the end here. We can move into questions. But it's, for me with AI, the most interesting things that I'm seeing come out of the AI space in the way that I've been following it is making it work for you, and where the most interesting work still involves heavily the use of the artist's human hand, and the AI functions more as a building block, where you're making raw material that, much in the same way that I was talking about pulling a stock photo, or sampling a sound, or doing a DJ set. It's just another way for me of creating an image that then is being remixed in a certain way, or put up against something else. And so in that way, I'm able to make it work for me. It doesn't just stop at, the generating and then leaving it and then just being an AI artist. It's an extension of the way I already get material utilized in my work visually. So then I just wanted to give a quick shout out to one of these artists who I think is doing cool things with AI. And I loved this quote, which I actually can't read because the Zoom window is blocking it. But there's a musician called Patton. Damien Roach is his real name. Who's a really cool electronic musician, and also I think a teacher. And he did an album a couple months ago that using a program called Riff Fusion, which they were billing it as the first album made with text to audio samples. So it's basically and if you listen to his other music, again, relating to what I was just saying, it sounds almost the approach is the same. It's chopping things up, it's remixing them, it's putting beats over kind of weird dissonant sounds, even before the AI got involved. So I think the approach here on this album is called Mirage FM. Was essentially using this program, which is still quite primitive, and it was giving these audio samples. You could type in guitar riff, 80s guitar riff, or something like that, and then you get a relatively lo-fi, low quality audio sample. I've messed around a little bit with it, And from what I understand, he just had a couple of days where he generated a ton of sounds, and then, much in the same way as you'd work with any sample material, he then just pulled pieces of that and was like making beats and loops out of them. So that's a really cool album, I think, to check out. And I love, he also did like for each, I don't know if it was for every track, but he did like an AI music video, whereas like it's got that, I'm sure you've seen like other videos like this, but it's got that kind of like, the images are like phasing into one another, and it's made, I think, with like a Mid-Journey or something like that. But what I love about this quote is this idea, this mention of like, it's like a lo-fi filter. He's talking about this specific program, but, and also the person who wrote this article, this idea of the AI not always quite understanding what you're doing, but you're still getting like gold out of it. And it's like a lo-fi pass over like an existing, sample. And then also this idea of a collage and a mixed media approach, be getting more opportunities for like magic and unexpected, possibilities. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. So we can do some questions, and that's
it's striking to just like to realize how similar basically like the AI engine is to your work approach as far as like being sort of collagey and pulling from history and culture. It's so wild to just see like, well, yeah, it's like natural that this would just be a tool that you would gravitate towards and incorporate into your workflow or your toolbox.
Yeah. And, I've gone in phases where like, I'll have, what's amazing about AI, I was just saying this to you before we joined the call, is like, you can work so quickly. And so there's been, kind of bursts where I'll be playing with the AI for even just a couple hours and get a ton of stuff that I then kind of just leave. And then later on, I'll go back to it and, do my screen recordings and figure out what was good out of that sample set. But it's not like I'm continuously working. So it's very similar to the way, again, as you said, the way that I'm already kind of approaching looking for subject matter out in the world. It's a lot of just like throwing stuff in the bank for later. But it is amazing, like the way that you can work so efficiently and like experiment, like that shorthand. It's definitely more fun than like trolling like stock video websites or something like that. So
nice. Well, I've got a bunch of questions, but I want to turn it over to the students first. So do either of you, any three of you have any questions? I can grease the wheels here. I had a question just because I really like the way that you talk about your workflow and how you'll be like taking images for sometimes maybe years before at some point you're like, okay, now I'm going to sort of wrap a container around it and make a body of work. I think you called it declaring a sequence, right? Mm-hmm. So like, how does engaging with the AI work into that? I mean, you just sort of addressed it a little bit, like you work in bursts. Like, do you just have like a folder of images in general, and like some of them happen to be AI, or especially with like being able to move so quickly, how does the AI archive that you build from compare to your, quote unquote, real image camera taken archive? And how does like diving into that archive work for you?
Yeah. So what's interesting is like for how much I was talking about the two working together, and I initially, and this might not be how it ends up, but initially with the camcorder specifically, it was like, well, that's the funnel that everything's going through in terms of the AI, and then also like the camcorder stuff that I'm shooting out and about. And I thought like they could coexist, and to some extent, I think they still can. Just through that baseline aesthetic intervention that's happening. But yeah, in terms of the organization of them on my computer, my work computer, it's like they're still separated. Like all the AI stuff, even though it's camcorder, is all that kind of raw footage where I've screen recorded, etc. Like that's all in its own folder. That's like the AI folder. And then all the kind of regular camcorder clips that I've done are in another place. And then where they're coming together again is like I've got a folder for the like zine that I'm thinking about making. So it's like the series name is like the folder. And then I'm throwing like the quote unquote finished images into that folder. So that could come from some of it's AI, some of it's not AI. And so they're mingling again once they get to that, as I said, not quite finished, but for, you know, at a certain point, I'm like, feels like it could go into a book, or it feels ready to be part of, you know, a body of work. That's when they go into a folder where they're all mixed together. But you know, like I said, when I get into some of these more recent ones, where to me, like they have a bit more of, I don't know, maybe not to the untrained eye, but I think if you're in tune with all this stuff, you might say, oh, that looks a little bit like Mid-Journey or something like that. Like, then I'm like, well, there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't know if that's then something else, or if that's like its own body of work that's like a third thing off to the side. You know, versus ones where I think it's a bit maybe more like imperceptible or like could sneak in like alongside, you know, some of this kind of, you know, non-AI, lo-fi, glitchy stuff. So yeah, that's like an ongoing question, right? Like, I definitely don't love the idea of like AI art, you know, as like a genre. I think it's like a tool and it's a medium that you pull from, more so than like this is now my new label or this is the label of the work. But you know, for now, like at least in terms of like saving those images out and stuff like that, like they're kind of being bunched together in their own space.
I see. Yeah, yeah. I have more questions, but anyone else want to jump in here?
Yeah. I just wondered, like, on some of the shots that you had where you were talking about mid-transition between two shots, were you purposely shooting that at the transition to capture that double exposure, or were some of them mistakes, or did you find any that were mistakes that you ended up using?
Yes. So,
Or
I mean,
not
how this
mistakes,
works?
by chance. Sorry.
Yeah. So there's a heavy element of like chance to it. Like a lot of times, um, like the way that these come about is like they're two clips like that are side by side, you know, on the mini DV tape that when you rewind them, it gives you this like it happens very quickly, right? These are screen grabs, obviously. So like you get this kind of crazy like glitching happening when you're rewinding it. And they're not always like, and then I'll basically go through like frame by frame and see if there's any interesting ones. They're not always like coherent. And you know, I think the ones that work the best are where, for me, like you can kind of have mostly one image and then there's like little bits and pieces of kind of nondescript like tones or something coming in above it. But you don't necessarily get that every time. And if, you know, unless I really am consciously recording, okay, here's clip number one, then the next time I hit record, I got to make sure it's something that maybe will look good, you know, in this kind of double exposure glitch effect. But just the way that I work, like it's not always like that. And sometimes I forget what I've recorded previously if the camera's been sitting down for a few days and I pick it up again. So it's kind of pure happenstance, but honestly, I didn't talk about it too much in this talk, but I've definitely talked about it in the past. Another thing that I think heavily influences me with art making is like, I did mention intuition and trusting, you know, just build up this image bank and go back to it later. I think that is important, but it's also like just trusting that the power of chance in this stuff and like happy accidents. There's like a lot of great philosophy if you look into like the original school of like surrealism and like the 1920s, like Salvador Dali and all that stuff. Like it basically just comes down to creating conditions for yourself and then saying whatever arises in these conditions is like what I'm going to get. And so there's a little bit of like, speaking something into existence there that I think is kind of cool. So yeah, to make a long story short, you don't always get like, this one, there's not really a double exposure. It's more just like a glitch happening that I thought suited it. But yeah, this was maybe one where I was like trying to plan it a bit more deliberately, where there's like two similar like variations that were on top of one another. But for the most part, no, it's not really planned. And then only sometimes do you get these like little tiny elements that kind of look cool and they get to live on.
Do you spend forever just like shuttling the tape back and forth to try to get different? I mean, because that'll like ruin a mini DV camera. But I just like, are you sitting there like rewind, fast forward, or you just capture once?
Sometimes I do. There's been a few if I feel really particular. I can't think of one like off the top of my head, but if there's one where I'm like, man, it's so close to being, because yeah, obviously you'll get different kind of effects every time, but it's not great for the camera, as you said. So every now and then I'll try to push to really get one. I'll do it a few times, but like I said, a lot of it is also like the happenstance and the kind of just trusting or hoping that you'll get one on that first basically when I import footage, I'll do like one full real time like played forward, and then I'll do like one rewind, and usually within that, if there's like a few different clips or a few different images and stuff in there, you'll get something good out of one of those. So
man, that's awesome. That's just like logistically, it's kind of cool to see your process there. We are pushing at the edge of our time here. Does anyone else have any questions? Cool. Yeah, Emmett, thank you so much for talking with us. Like, I love your process in that it doesn't stop at the output of the AI generator. And it's just this constant like mediation, this constant engagement. What do you say? You engage with the simulation itself. Yeah, so I love like those layers and layers. And also like your work, to hear you talk about your work, it's like pretty holistic. There's like so much like trust and like give yourself the chance and trust that things like I really like hearing that. Like I feel like when I engage with my work, there's so much like second guessing and like hesitance. So it just feels really good to hear you talk about like, yeah, like let's save that image, it'll come back.
Oh, and there's a ton of, there's definitely a ton of hesitance and like second guessing in my practice as well, as with a lot of artists, I'm sure. But yeah, it's like all the while, like, yeah, pushing through and like, I say this like half jokingly all the time. I'm sure you've heard it, where it's like a lot of times I shoot stuff and I'm like, I don't even want to look at that again for like a year, or like until I sort of forget about it, and then I can go back to it with fresh eyes, because that's when the second guessing and the, oh, is this good, or what is this for, all that kind of gets washed away by time. And then even when I was preparing for this, I went back in like my Discord Midjourney thing and like was looking back at stuff I had made in like January, and I was like, wow, I forgot about this and this other thing. And I kind of was able to create some new like screen capture, record some new stuff just in the last couple of days that I had originally generated like back in January. So there's always that element of like, what am I doing, and is this legitimate or whatever? But when you keep building and building and building over time, it's like like your product gets built like while you're kind of wondering if you're building it.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, the link to Emmett's site and his Instagram is in the class, so please give Emmett a follow or check out his website. Emmett did not touch on this at all, but he's legit with the clients that he's working with in Los Angeles, so swing by his website and check it out. Cool. Thank you, Emmett. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, always fun to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in, those of you who tuned in.
Special thanks to Evan for tuning in from Amsterdam, where it's now 1 a.m.
Yeah, big.
That's crazy.
Cool. All right, everyone, take care. I'm super excited to leave you feedback on your Transcendence images. Those are awesome. So, cool. I will talk to you all later. Thanks for being here.
Awesome.
Take care. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
See you. Take care.